Thank you so much to NJTPA for hosting today. Jeff and Jennifer really did all of the legwork on this, and I know it was quite a lot of work to get this pulled into a panel for today, so thank you. So I'm here to provide a little bit of the regional context for electric vehicles in the Northeast. It sounds like we've already got a little bit of background on the market, but I'll give kind of a quick overview on how electric vehicles are doing nationwide, and then can talk about some of the work that a group of states in the Northeast have been doing to promote electric vehicles and some of the resources that have been created to help towns and cities be prepared for EVs. So. All right, so we already went over this a little bit, but electric sales have really been climbing steadily in the U.S. since they really came back to the market in 2011. My outdated statistic is that over 100,000 EVs have been sold. That was from June. We're now up to 150,000. And so it's just been growing exponentially, and we expect a lot more sales in the future. In the media, we hear a lot of negative stories about EVs that are catching on fire and other bad things because it makes for a good story. But the reality is that EVs are selling. One little point that we like to talk about is that twice as many EVs were sold in the first 2 years of production than hybrids. And now hybrids make up, I think, almost 3% of the market share in the U.S. I want to pause for just a second and maybe take a little head count. How many folks here are familiar with the difference between a battery electric vehicle and a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle? Okay, so it seems like we're all on the same page and we all know kind of the basics of EVs, so I won't go into that. Well, back to it. EVs are selling. One of the projections shows that we're on the road to 1 million EVs by 2018. So we are well on our way. And folks are buying these vehicles for a number of reasons. One that we've really already gone over is the obvious environmental benefits. EVs produce zero tailpipe emissions. Even when they're charged from a portion of the electric grid that is dirty, the electricity comes predominantly from coal, they're still cleaner than if you were to drive a gasoline car. Folks are also buying these because they're a really neat new piece of technology. They're kind of flashy, they're fun to drive, they're the new hot thing, and people are buying them. People are also buying the vehicles because it really promotes energy independence. Since EVs are charged with electricity is generated almost entirely from domestic sources of fuel, coal, natural gas, and renewables. So it's a great way to promote energy independence. And folks who buy EVs also experience quite significant fuel savings. I know we hear a lot about the high upfront cost of EVs, but one study shows that you can save up to $13,000 over the life of a vehicle in fuel savings. I know that the Department of Energy just came out with this neat vehicle cost calculator where you can plug in the kind of car, like a gasoline car that you're thinking of buying, and then plug in an EV, and you can show just how long it will take for the EV to pay for itself. Kind of a neat tool. But along those lines, folks are also drawn to these because there are a number of incentives in place right now. You hear some different things from people, but the federal incentive is a $7,500 tax credit on an electric vehicle, which dramatically reduces the price. A lot of states also have certain incentives for EVs. State of New Jersey, I believe, has a sales tax exemption, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. So the vehicle incentives are also kind of helping folks warm up to the idea of buying a higher priced car up front because it'll pay off in the long run. And finally, they're really convenient cars. You don't have to go to gas stations anymore. You can just drive home, plug in the vehicle, and it'll be recharged overnight. So people are buying these vehicles for a number of reasons. There are a lot of benefits, and states are beginning to really embrace the technology as well. And one collaboration of states, the Transportation and Climate Initiative in particular, is really supportive of EVs. So Georgetown is the facilitator of TCI, which is why I'm here talking with you today. And TCI is a collaboration of the transportation, energy, and environment officials from 11 Northeast states and the District of Columbia. And we work with one another to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation arena. Do that through a variety of mechanisms. The staff from each of the states get together on calls on a regular basis with work groups to talk through some of the issues and how the states can work with one another to address them. And the work group that has really been probably the most active in the last couple of years has been the Clean Vehicles and Fuels work group, which in 2011 launched the Northeast Electric Vehicle Network. Excuse me. The network was launched in 2011, and it's really a commitment by the states to work with one another to reduce barriers to EVs, to coordinate with each other on new programs and policies. This is just a screenshot of the website that was launched this year. On that, the network, thank you, on that, the network has a map of the charging stations in the region and also a variety of tools that planners and policymakers can use. Those tools were made possible by a Department of Energy electric vehicle planning grant, which allowed TCI to work with Chuck Feinberg with New Jersey Clean Cities and 15 of the other coalitions in the region, as well as the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority to engage stakeholders, both locally and regionally, to create some technical guidance documents like citing a design guidelines and some best practices on zoning and parking ordinances, as well as a literature review of market barriers to EVs, and then some educational pieces. One thing I want to touch on before I really start diving into the details of some of these products is the importance of stakeholder engagement. I think everyone in the room is familiar with just how important it is to make sure that you get feedback on what you're doing from stakeholders before and during the process. TCI and the states engaged the car companies as well as the EV charging station suppliers, utilities, nonprofit organizations, state governments, early on in the process and a couple times throughout to try to create a vision for what this network could be and to try to identify barriers that were facing EVs. At the same time, the coalitions in the region were engaging auto dealers as well as utilities at the local level, as well as municipalities and business owners and others to also identify what the barriers to EVs were in each of the states and in town and cities throughout the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. It was great because through the stakeholder engagement we were able to kind of get a sense of what we needed to create and the types of materials that would be the most useful to planners and policymakers in our region, and also allowed us to come back to them throughout the process and get feedback on it. This is going in the right direction, et cetera. So with that, I think I'm going to dive into now some of the work products that were created. Just as a heads up, I've put some examples on the back table. Feel free to take a look at them after we're done here. And all these materials can also be found online at northeastevs.org. But the first piece I want to talk about is really a 10,000-foot view of EV deployment in the region. It's an assessment of current electric vehicle and charging station deployment. What this does is we took a look at the communities where EVs are located, as well as where the charging stations are located. We took a look at that at a zip code level and compared that to then demographic characteristics in each of those areas. And with that, we were able to create kind of a map, a high-level snapshot of what communities look like that have a lot of EVs in them. Not surprisingly, EVs are generally located in the suburban areas of large MSAs. And generally, those neighborhoods tend to be a little bit more educated, a little bit older, and have a lot of other characteristics that are common with more expensive cars. But what this is a good thing to take a look at is that it gives you a snapshot of what communities that have EVs are looking like, and will give you an idea of what new communities are probably going to be adopting EVs next. So it's kind of a good kind of grounding point. But then after that, we really zoomed it a little bit closer to the 1,000-foot level. And we took a look at the specific types of sites where planners and policymakers may wish to prioritize investment in charging stations. We call these clusters, and the authors of the reports, who I should mention are Energetics Incorporated and WXY Architects, they've done a fantastic job with these. They prioritize 9 land use clusters that are really strong areas of current and potential charging station deployment. These include medical campuses, downtown destinations like where we are now, higher education campuses, commercial office complexes, buildings, office parks, a retail establishment like a mall, apartments and condo complexes, places like theaters and other places of leisure where you go for a few hours, regional transportation hubs, and also fleet and freight headquarters. And one of the characteristics that all these have in common is that you park there for several hours at a time. Although we're definitely moving into the era where DC fast charging is going to become more viable. Right now, most of the public charging stations that are still economically most popular and feasible are the level 2 stations, and those take a couple hours to recharge your car. So by prioritizing investment, you may get the most bang for your buck, and these are also places where EV owners often go. So then the cluster analysis is just, it's a good thing to kind of get a framework for the types of locations where you may wish to prioritize EV charging station investment. But then after that, we went a little bit closer and took a look at the siting and design guidelines. And this really takes a look at the site and offers a host of recommendations for planners and policymakers to consider when they are installing charging stations. So the siting and design guidelines make recommendations for individual sites at apartment and condo complexes, at commercial office buildings, at on-street parking, at service plazas, and at fleet headquarters. Those are kind of the 5 examples, but a lot of these recommendations can be taken to other areas as well. Here we have an example of some of the recommendations from the report of things to think about when you're going to be installing a charging station on the street. Things like you need to keep in mind the signage and wayfinding, how that's critical. You've got to be able to get to the station and find it and then figure out what parking spot you need to park in. Street markings are always helpful. You'll want to save space on-street parking by making a simple type of design. Oftentimes there's not a lot of space. Also want to take into consideration where the electricity will come from. Oftentimes with public space, you'll be near a light post or another public source of electricity, but if not, might need to strike a deal with the property owner to get access to their electrical supply. And also to allow enough space so that the vehicle owner can actually plug in the vehicle in a safe way. You hear some stories about people not quite having enough space to plug in, and bad things happen. The siting and design guidelines then go into some more detail on a variety of levels. One thing is that it does give some general guidance for how, what to keep in mind with siting charging stations that are compliant with ADA regulations. This is very similar to any type of a parking space, a design, but you do need to make sure there's enough room, for example, for the vehicle owner to get to the charging station in a safe way. The guidelines also provide some recommendations for the signage. This is something especially for a community or an office park or a private industry who wants to have up a bunch of wayfinding signs. To keep in mind things like a combination of symbol and text is always good. The term charging can be used to ensure that hybrid vehicles don't use the space. One of the common things we see is icing out, internal combustion engined out parking spaces, and people who drive gas cars, they just don't know that they can't park there, and so a person with an EV will pull up to the space, they'll want to charge because they're almost out of juice, and they can't park, and so they can't plug in, and that's a problem. So there are a number of these types of recommendations in the guidelines that kind of tease out the questions that should be asked when putting in charging stations. Another tool that we've created that really gets in the weeds is the Guide to Planning and Policy Tools. And this kind of gives guidance to practitioners at the local level and the state level with best practices on zoning regulations, parking regulations, building codes, permitting, as well as partnership and procurement practices. It goes through the type of things that you should keep in mind when thinking through, gosh, how can I alleviate some of the regulatory barriers in my town or city to EVs? And it goes through, well, here are things to consider with our zoning ordinances. Here are things that we can do with the zoning to tweak it to make it more EV friendly. I won't go through all of these, but I will kind of highlight some of the actions that you can take in the world of zoning. One thing is just to make sure that EV charging stations can be permitted in locations. It's a relatively new piece of technology. Some places define charging stations as appliances so that you don't have to go through a lot of extra permitting or zoning hurdles, but others you need to take some extra steps. You also want to be able to set up pretty high-level criteria for design, accessibility, and parking enforcement. You could also do something like require or incentivize EV charging stations in locations, offering a development type of a bonus, something like that. One of the examples is that a town in Massachusetts adopted an addendum to their zoning regulation that specifies that EV charging stations can be a permissible use in a couple of different places. So these are kind of tools that you can use to tackle some of those regulatory barriers that might, if they're not tackled, kind of make it harder for EVs to be adopted in a town or city. The last kind of in the Weeds document I want to mention is an overview of EV case studies. The ones we've been talking about are really tools that you can use as a planner or a policy person to alleviate barriers in the regulatory world. But this is kind of nice because this document interviews, I think, 9 or 10 business owners and charging station hosts and asks them, how much did it cost to put in your charging station? Is it being used? Why did you install the charging station? And it's a high-level overview of the decision process that a charging station owner went through to install it. So it's a great kind of introductory text to anyone who wants to learn about the process you go through and the reasons you might choose to install charging stations. So in addition to all these really technical resources that planners and policymakers can use, TCI also created a suite of educational materials that can be used by consumers. These are really designed to give an introduction to EVs, what the benefits to electric vehicles are, what the level of charges are, what an electric vehicle is. A lot of folks you talk to and they don't know that you can just take an electric vehicle and plug it into a wall outlet like any of the ones around this room and it'll charge. It can be as easy as that. So there are a bunch of the brochures. Oh, it didn't quite turn up, did it? Well, it's a full version of that graphic in the back on the copies of the brochures, so please go check it out. And inside there are a lot of really great, just kind of high-level tidbits on EVs. And then in addition to the brochure, as I mentioned earlier, there's a website that has all of these resources as well as links to other pieces of information and other websites that are particularly helpful and of use. And TCI also created a bunch of brochure inserts, which are really targeted towards stakeholder groups. So there's a piece of like a pamphlet that's targeted towards apartment and condominium stakeholders. There's pamphlets that's targeted to utilities and to employers. I think I have an example here for some of the information that's targeted towards the local governments. These are just kind of different actions that local governments can consider when they want to promote EVs. There are government actions like creating an EV charging station plan or EV deployment plan for the community. There are policy actions like implementing some of the zoning changes that we talked about, as well as some education and awareness actions like outreach or events like this today. And so all of these pieces, again, can be found online. The last thing I just want to mention is there are a lot of resources right now on electric vehicles. Our website, northeastevs.org, has all the pieces we talked about, links to other pieces, and it's kind of a comprehensive database for the states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Chuck's website, and JCCC, is also a great source for the state of New Jersey. And I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot about the great information and resources available to folks in the state here today. And then also the U.S. Department of Energy's alternative fuel data site. They have information on laws and incentives that are available. They have information about how the technology works. They have information about where charging stations are located. It's a really great tool, so I encourage you to check it out. And I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up, but thank you again for organizing this, Jeff and Jen and NJTBA. And I'm happy to take any questions. So, thanks. Okay.